No one would help the kitten in the drain, but then an unexpected hero arrived. The silence in the house was deafening. George shuffled through the rooms, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams that slanted through the windows, illuminating the stillness of the furniture draped in white sheets. It had been 6 months since Martha, his wife of 50 years, had passed away, and the house still felt eerily vacant. George was a man of routine. Every morning, he woke up at 6 a.m., made himself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, staring out at the quiet suburban street. The familiar sights: Mrs. Henderson tending her roses, Mr. Johnson jogging with his Labrador, the kids cycling to school, used to bring him a sense of comfort. Now they only served as a stark reminder of his solitude. After Martha's passing, George had retreated into himself, his world shrinking to the confines of his house. He rarely ventured out except for the occasional trip to the grocery store or the library. His friends had tried to reach out, inviting him to dinners and social gatherings, but he politely declined. He preferred the company of his memories, even if they were tinged with sadness. One evening, as George was preparing his usual dinner of microwave soup and a cheese sandwich, a faint sound pierced the silence. It was a high-pitched cry, barely audible, coming from somewhere outside. He paused, listening intently. The cry came again, a desperate plea that tugged at his heartstrings. Curiosity piqued, George moved towards the front door. He opened it cautiously, stepping out onto the porch. The cry was louder now, and he could tell it was coming from the street. He walked towards the curb, peering into the darkness. There, in the dim glow of the streetlight, he saw a small, dark shape huddled near the sewer drain. As he approached, the cry grew more intense. It was a kitten, its tiny body shivering, its eyes wide with fear. It was trapped, its head poking out from the narrow opening of the drain, its plaintive cries echoing in the night. George's heart went out to the creature. He knelt down, trying to coax the kitten out, but it was too frightened to move. He reached out a hand, but the kitten recoiled, its cries growing more frantic. Frustrated and worried, George returned to his house, the kitten's cries echoing in his ears. He couldn't leave the poor creature to its fate, but he didn't know how to help. He spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, the kitten's cries haunting his dreams. The following morning, George woke with a start. The kitten's cries were still ringing in his ears, though fainter now, as if exhaustion had begun to take its toll. He rose from his bed, the usual heaviness of his solitude amplified by the knowledge of the small creature suffering just outside his home. He brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar aroma doing little to soothe his troubled mind. He couldn't shake the image of the kitten, its tiny form swallowed by the cold metal of the drain. He decided he needed help. His first stop was Mrs. Henderson, his next-door neighbor. He found her in her garden, her gloved hands delicately pruning her rose bushes. "Morning, George," she greeted him with a warm smile. "You're up and about early. Anything I can do for you?" George hesitated. He wasn't used to asking for help, and the words felt awkward on his tongue. "Well, actually, there's a kitten stuck in the sewer drain down the street," he stammered. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered. "Oh dear," she said, her brow furrowing. "That's terrible. Have you called animal control?" "Not yet," George admitted. I was hoping maybe we could do something." Mrs. Henderson sighed. "George, I'm sure they're the best ones to handle this. Those drains can be quite dangerous. You shouldn't try to do anything yourself." Discouraged, George thanked Mrs. Henderson and moved on. He approached Mr. Johnson, who was washing his car in his driveway. Mr. Johnson, a burly man with a gruff exterior, listened to George's story with a skeptical frown. "A kitten, huh?" he said, scratching his head. "Well, that's nature for you. Survival of the fittest. Can't interfere with that." George tried to explain the kitten's distress, but Mr. Johnson remained unconvinced. "Look, I appreciate your concern," he said, But I've got my own things to worry about. Call the city. That's what they're there for. Feeling increasingly disheartened, George decided to try the local animal shelter. He drove to the small, brick building, his hopes rising as he saw the sign with its painted paw print. Inside, a young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Sarah listened patiently to his story. "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention, Mr. George," he supplied. "Mr. George." Sarah continued. "Unfortunately, we're short-staffed today, and most of our volunteers are out on calls. We can put in a request, but it might take a while for someone to get to it." George felt a wave of despair wash over him. He thanked Sarah and left the shelter, the weight of his own helplessness pressing down on him. He drove back home. The image of the trapped kitten burned into his mind. He had to do something. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed a group of children playing across the street. Among them was Emily, a bright-eyed girl of about 10, known in the neighborhood for her love of animals. He had often seen her rescuing stray birds and tending to injured squirrels. Maybe, just maybe, she could help. George crossed the street, his footsteps heavier than usual. He approached the group of children hesitantly, feeling a bit awkward intruding on their games. Emily, with her bright red hair and freckled nose, spotted him first. "Hi, Mr. George," she chirped, her face breaking into a wide grin. "You're out and about. We haven't seen you in ages." The other children, a mix of boys and girls, echoed her greeting, their youthful energy a stark contrast to George's weary demeanor. "Hello, Emily," George replied, managing a weak smile. "I was wondering if I could have a word with you." Emily readily agreed, excusing herself from her friends. George led her a few steps away from the group, lowering his voice as he recounted the story of the trapped kitten. Emily listened intently, her eyes widening with concern. "Oh no, the poor thing," she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine distress. "We have to help it, Mr. George." George was taken aback by her immediate empathy. "I've tried," he explained, "but I can't seem to get it out. I've asked some of the neighbors and the animal shelter, but no one seems to be able to come right away." Emily's brow furrowed in thought. "Well, we can't just leave it there," she declared, her voice firm with determination. "Maybe we can try together. Two heads are better than one, right?" George felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Emily's enthusiasm was contagious, and her confidence was reassuring. He nodded, a genuine smile finally spreading across his face. "You're right, Emily," he said. "Let's see what we can do." Together, they walked towards the sewer drain. The kitten's cries were weaker now, barely a whimper. George felt a pang of guilt for not being able to help sooner. "It sounds tired," Emily whispered, her voice laced with worry. "We need to be careful, Mr. George. We don't want to scare it." George nodded, appreciating her thoughtful approach. He peered into the drain, trying to assess the situation. The kitten was lodged about a foot down, its small body wedged between the pipe and the concrete wall. "I think we need something to reach it," George said, thinking aloud. "Maybe a long stick or a net?" Emily's eyes lit up. "I have a fishing net at home," she exclaimed. "My dad takes me fishing sometimes. I'll be right back." And with that, she dashed across the street, her red hair flying behind her like a banner of hope. George watched her go, a warmth spreading through his chest. He hadn't felt this sense of purpose in months. Emily returned a few minutes later, slightly out of breath but beaming with determination. In her hands, she clutched a child-sized fishing net, its bright blue handle a stark contrast to the grime of the sewer drain. "Here it is, Mr. George," she announced, handing him the net. "It's not very big, but it might work." George took the net, examining it carefully. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they had at the moment. He knelt by the drain, peering into the darkness. The kitten was barely visible now, his cries reduced to faint whimpers. "We need to be quick," he said, his voice tight with worry. "It sounds like it's getting weaker." He gently lowered the net into the drain, trying to maneuver it towards the kitten. The narrow opening made it difficult to reach the trapped animal. The kitten, sensing the movement, let out a distressed meow. "Easy there, little one," George murmured, his voice soothing. "We're here to help." Emily knelt beside him, her eyes fixed on the drain. "Maybe if we shine a light, we can see better," she suggested. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, switching on the flashlight. He angled the light into the drain, illuminating the kitten's scared face. It was a calico, its fur matted and dirty, its eyes wide with fear. "Poor thing," Emily whispered, her voice filled with compassion. George tried again with the net, but the kitten was too far down. The net kept getting caught on the edges of the drain, making it impossible to reach the frightened animal. Frustration mounted as their efforts proved futile. "It's no use," George sighed, his shoulders slumping. "The net's too small, and the opening's too narrow." Emily bit her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. "What if we try to lure it out?" she suggested. "Maybe with some food?" George considered the idea. "That might work," he said. "But what kind of food? I don't have any cat food at home." Emily's eyes lit up. "I do," she exclaimed. "I have a can of tuna in my lunchbox. My mom packs it for me sometimes." She rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a small can of tuna. George watched in amusement as she carefully peeled back the lid, the strong fishy scent filling the air. "Hopefully it likes tuna," Emily said, holding the can towards the drain. The kitten, sensing the food, let out a weak meow. It tried to move towards the smell, but its body was still wedged tightly. "It's working," Emily whispered excitedly. George felt a surge of hope. They were making progress. He held the net ready, hoping to catch the kitten if it managed to free itself. The kitten struggled for a few minutes, its tiny claws scraping against the concrete. Then, with a final push, it wriggled free, tumbling into the net. "We got it!" Emily cried out, her voice filled with triumph. George carefully lifted the net, cradling the kitten in his hands. It was trembling and weak, but alive. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. "You did it, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Emily beamed, her eyes shining with pride. "We saved it, Mr. George," she exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. They looked at each other, a shared sense of accomplishment bonding them in that moment. The kitten, nestled in George's hands, let out a soft purr, as if expressing its gratitude. With the kitten safely rescued, a new wave of concern washed over George. The small creature was clearly in distress, its fur matted with dirt and grime, its breathing shallow and rapid. "We need to get it to a vet," George said, his voice laced with worry. "It might be injured." Emily nodded in agreement. "Do you want me to come with you, Mr. George?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern for the kitten. George hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to company, but he also didn't want to face this alone. Besides, Emily had been instrumental in the rescue, and he felt a sense of responsibility towards her. "Yes, Emily," he said. "I'd appreciate that." He carefully wrapped the kitten in his handkerchief, its tiny body fitting snugly in his palm. He then walked back to his house with Emily, explaining that he needed to get his car keys and wallet. As they drove to the nearest animal clinic, George couldn't help but steal glances at Emily. Her youthful energy and genuine concern for the kitten were a stark contrast to the gloom that had enveloped him for the past months. He found himself opening up to her, sharing his worries about the kitten's health and his own struggles with loneliness since Martha's passing. Emily listened patiently, her young eyes filled with understanding beyond her years. She shared stories of her own pets, her love for animals evident in every word. George felt a connection with her, a sense of kinship he hadn't experienced in a long time. At the clinic, a kind-faced veterinarian named Dr. Anderson examined the kitten thoroughly. George and Emily waited anxiously as the doctor checked for injuries. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Anderson emerged from the examination room. "Well," she said, a reassuring smile on her face, The good news is there are no broken bones. The kitten is a bit dehydrated and malnourished, and it has a slight respiratory infection, probably from being exposed to the cold and damp conditions in the sewer. George and Emily breathed a sigh of relief. We'll keep her here for a few days to monitor her and get her started on some medication, Dr. Anderson continued. With proper care, she should make a full recovery. George thanked the doctor profusely, his heart filled with gratitude. He and Emily left the clinic, promising to return the next day to check on their rescued kitten. As they walked back to the car, Emily turned to George, her eyes sparkling. "What are you going to name her, Mr. George?" she asked. George paused, considering the question. He looked at Emily, then back at the clinic, a thought forming in his mind. "How about Hope?" he said, a soft smile gracing his lips. "Hope, because she gave me hope." Emily beamed. "I love it, Mr. George. Hope is a perfect name." As they drove back to George's house, a sense of warmth filled the car. The silence was no longer deafening, but companionable. George felt a glimmer of light pierce through the darkness that had enveloped him for so long. He had found a purpose, a connection, and perhaps a new beginning. The next few days fell into a comfortable rhythm for George. He woke each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, the heaviness of grief replaced by a flutter of anticipation. After his usual coffee by the window, he would head to the animal clinic to visit Hope. Emily, true to her word, joined him every day after school. They would sit by Hope's cage, talking to her in soft voices, marveling at her resilience and playful spirit. Dr. Anderson updated them on Hope's progress, noting her improving appetite and increasing energy levels. George found himself looking forward to these visits, to Emily's cheerful chatter and Hope's playful antics. He started noticing things he hadn't paid attention to in months: the changing colors of the leaves, the laughter of children playing in the park, the friendly greetings of his neighbors. The world seemed to be coming back to life around him. One afternoon, as they were leaving the clinic, Emily turned to George with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. George," she began, "when Hope is ready to come home, will you keep her?" George was taken aback by the question. He hadn't really thought that far ahead. He had been so focused on Hope's recovery that the idea of actually keeping her hadn't fully registered. I don't know, Emily," he replied honestly. "I haven't had a pet in years. I'm not sure I'm up to the task." Emily's face fell. "But Mr. George," she pleaded, "you saved her life, and she loves you. I can tell." George looked at Emily, her earnest expression tugging at his heartstrings. He thought about the emptiness of his house, the silence that had become his constant companion. He thought about Hope, her playful spirit, and the way she looked at him with those big, trusting eyes. "You're right, Emily," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I would like that very much." Emily's face lit up. "Oh, Mr. George, that's wonderful!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him in a spontaneous hug. George was startled by the gesture, but he couldn't help but return the embrace. He felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling of connection he hadn't experienced in a long time. As they walked towards his car, George felt a sense of anticipation building within him. He was bringing Hope home. He was opening his heart and his home to a new companion, a new beginning. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this was exactly what he needed. The day Hope was discharged from the clinic was a joyous occasion. George meticulously prepared his home for her arrival, purchasing a cozy bed, food and water bowls, a scratching post, and a variety of toys. He even rearranged his living room furniture to create a safe and comfortable space for his new companion. Emily, brimming with excitement, arrived early to help George pick up Hope. They drove to the clinic, their anticipation growing with each passing mile. Dr. Anderson greeted them with a warm smile, handing them a small carrier containing a now healthy and vibrant Hope. "She's all set to go home," Dr. Anderson said, handing George a sheet of care instructions. "Just make sure she eats regularly, takes her medication, and gets plenty of rest. And of course, lots of love and attention." George and Emily assured Dr. Anderson they would take excellent care of Hope. As they drove back to George's house, Hope peeked out from her carrier, her curious eyes taking in her new surroundings. Back at the house, George gently placed the carrier on the floor and opened the door. Hope hesitated for a moment, then cautiously stepped out, her tiny paws exploring the unfamiliar terrain. She sniffed the furniture, rubbed against George's legs, and batted at a dangling toy with playful curiosity. Emily, unable to contain her excitement, scooped Hope into her arms, showering her with affection. Hope responded with purrs and head bumps, her contentment evident. "She loves it here, Mr. George," Emily exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. "Look how happy she is." George watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with warmth. The house, once filled with silence and sadness, now echoed with the sounds of life, Hope's soft purrs, Emily's cheerful chatter, and his own laughter. Over the next few weeks, Hope settled into her new home, bringing with her a vibrancy that George had long forgotten. She followed him from room to room, curled up on his lap while he read, and greeted him with enthusiastic meows whenever he returned from an errand. George, in turn, embraced his role as Hope's caregiver. He diligently followed Dr. Anderson's instructions, ensuring Hope received her medication and nutritious meals. He spent hours playing with her, discovering a playful side he hadn't tapped into in years. He also found himself venturing out more often, taking Hope for short walks in the neighborhood. He would often encounter Emily and her friends, who were always eager to greet Hope and shower her with attention. These interactions, once a source of anxiety for George, now brought him a sense of community and belonging. Hope's presence had not only filled the void left by Martha but had also opened up a new chapter in George's life, one filled with unexpected joy, companionship, and a renewed sense of purpose. As the weeks turned into months, George and Hope settled into a comfortable routine. The house was no longer filled with the oppressive silence of grief, but with the comforting sounds of Hope's purrs, the jingle of her collar as she explored her domain, and the gentle clinking of her food bowl at mealtimes. George, once a recluse, now found himself venturing out more often, taking Hope for walks in the park and engaging in conversations with his neighbors. He even started attending the monthly community potluck dinners, bringing along Hope as his charming companion. However, this newfound happiness was not without its challenges. One evening, as George was preparing dinner, he noticed Hope limping. He knelt down to examine her paw, discovering a small cut on her pad. Panic surged through him. He remembered Dr. Anderson's warning about keeping Hope's wounds clean to prevent infection. He immediately called the clinic, but it was already closed for the day. He tried to clean the wound himself, but Hope, usually docile, resisted his touch, hissing and withdrawing in pain. George felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He hated seeing Hope in distress and felt responsible for her well-being. He spent a restless night, constantly checking on Hope, worrying about the possibility of infection. The next morning, he rushed her to the clinic, his anxiety growing with each passing mile. Dr. Anderson examined Hope's paw, reassuring George that the cut was minor and would heal quickly with proper care. She cleaned the wound, applied an antibiotic ointment, and bandaged the paw. "Just keep it clean and dry," she instructed George, "and try to keep her from licking it." George thanked Dr. Anderson profusely, relieved that Hope's injury was not serious. However, the incident left him shaken. He realized that caring for Hope came with a responsibility he hadn't fully anticipated. He was no longer just responsible for himself. He was responsible for this small, vulnerable creature who depended on him for everything. This realization brought with it a mix of emotions: love, protectiveness, and a renewed sense of purpose, but also a fear of failing Hope, of not being able to provide her with the care she needed. As he drove home with Hope nestled beside him, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do everything in his power to keep Hope safe and healthy. He would be the companion she needed, the protector she deserved. He would honor the trust she had placed in him, the trust that had brought light back into his life. The incident with Hope's injured paw served as a wake-up call for George. He realized that despite his growing bond with Hope and his reemergence into the world, he was still somewhat isolated. He needed a support system not just for himself but for Hope as well. He started by reaching out to his neighbors, sharing his concerns and seeking their advice on pet care. To his surprise, he found a wealth of knowledge and support within his own community. Mrs. Henderson, the avid gardener, offered tips on creating a cat-friendly garden, while Mr. Johnson, the gruff car enthusiast, shared stories of his childhood dog and offered to help with any heavy lifting. He also reconnected with Sarah, the kind woman from the animal shelter. She invited him to attend a pet care workshop, where he learned about basic first aid, nutrition, and behavioral training. He even signed up for a weekly dog walking group, finding camaraderie with other pet owners and enjoying the shared experience of caring for animals. One afternoon, while walking Hope in the park, George encountered a group of children playing frisbee. Among them was Emily, her red hair shining in the sunlight. She spotted George and Hope, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Mr. George," she exclaimed, rushing over to greet them. "Look at Hope. She's getting so big." Hope, recognizing Emily, purred and rubbed against her legs. The other children gathered around, petting Hope and showering her with compliments. George watched the scene unfold, his heart filled with gratitude. Emily and her friends had become an extended family to him and Hope, offering companionship, support, and a sense of belonging. He realized that the kindness of strangers, the shared love for animals, and the simple act of connecting with others had woven a safety net around him and Hope. He was no longer alone in his journey. He had found a community, a support system, and a renewed sense of purpose, all thanks to a little kitten who had stumbled into his life. Time, once a stagnant pool in George's life, now flowed like a gentle stream, carrying him along on a current of contentment. Seasons changed. Leaves turned from vibrant green to fiery hues of orange and red, then fell to the ground, blanketing the streets in a tapestry of autumn. Winter arrived, bringing with it frosty mornings and cozy evenings by the fireplace. Hope curled up contentedly on his lap. Spring emerged, painting the world in fresh greens and vibrant blossoms, and with it came the anniversary of Martha's passing. George, once dreading the day, now approached it with a sense of quiet acceptance. He visited Martha's grave, placing a bouquet of her favorite lilies on the headstone. He spoke to her in a soft voice, sharing stories of his life with Hope, the joy she had brought him, and the new connections he had forged. He no longer felt the crushing weight of grief, but a gentle ache of remembrance, a bittersweet nostalgia for the life they had shared. He knew Martha would have been happy for him, happy that he had found companionship and purpose again. As he left the cemetery, a sense of peace settled over him. He was no longer just surviving. He was living, embracing each day with gratitude and appreciation. He had found a new normal, a life filled with love, companionship, and a renewed sense of purpose, all thanks to a tiny creature who had cried out for help on a dark night. That evening, George sat by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, purple, and pink. Hope, now a sleek and playful cat, rubbed against his legs, purring contentedly. He picked her up, stroking her soft fur, a smile gracing his lips. "You know, Hope," he said softly, "you saved me as much as I saved you." Hope blinked her golden eyes, as if understanding his words. She nuzzled her head against his cheek, a silent affirmation of their bond. A knock on the door interrupted their quiet moment. George opened it to find Emily standing on the porch, a basket of freshly baked cookies in her hand. "Hi, Mr. George." She greeted him with her usual cheerful smile. "I made these for you and Hope." George invited her in, his heart warming at the sight of his young friend. They spent the evening sharing stories, laughing and playing with Hope. As Emily was leaving, she turned to George, her eyes shining with affection. "You know, Mr. George," she said, "you're like a grandpa to me now." George's eyes welled up with tears. He hugged Emily tightly, feeling a sense of belonging and connection he hadn't experienced in years. He watched her walk down the street, her silhouette bathed in the soft glow of the streetlight. He closed the door, a sense of contentment washing over him. He was no longer alone. He had hope, he had Emily, he had his community. He had found his way back to life, full circle, to a place of love, connection, and gratitude.
The grumpy fisherman hated the stray cat stealing his fish until he discovered where it was taking them. What he did next stunned the whole village. The scent of brine and diesel fuel was the first thing Marco Rossi registered each morning, long before the weak dawn light penetrated the perpetual gray fog clinging to Haven Point. It was the smell of his life, ingrained in his skin, his clothes, the very wood of the small weathered house he inhabited alone near the harbor. At 71, Marco was as much a fixture of this small Maine fishing village as the granite breakwater or the squawking gulls that wheeled endlessly overhead. And like the breakwater, he was known primarily for his rugged exterior and the distinct impression that he preferred to be left undisturbed. His days were ruled by the tides and the toil of coaxing a living from the cold, unforgiving Atlantic. Before sunrise, he'd be down at the docks, his slightly stooped figure moving with the stiff but practiced economy of a man who'd spent 50 years wrestling nets and traps aboard his small lobster boat, the Maria, named for the wife he'd lost 2 decades ago. The boat was his only real companion, its aging diesel engine a more reliable conversation partner, in Marco's estimation, than most people in Haven Point. He fished alone now. His son, Antonio, who should have been working the stern beside him, had been taken by a sudden illness before he'd even turned 30, a loss that had carved deep lines of grief into Marco's face and shuttered something essential within him. After Maria passed a few years later, the shutters had closed completely, leaving only the gruff, solitary fisherman the village knew today. He worked hard, his catches usually decent through sheer persistence and long acquired knowledge of the local waters. But the joy, if there ever had been much, was gone, replaced by a grim determination to simply get through the day, pay the bills, and endure the quiet ache of his solitary evenings. His temper, always simmering beneath the surface, was legendary down at the wharf, directed at tangled gear, balky engines, fluctuating fish prices, careless tourists, and, most reliably, at the brazen orange cat that plagued his unloading routine. This particular creature, a tough-looking tomcat of indeterminate age but evident street smarts, seemed to have singled Marco out. Every single day, as Marco maneuvered the heavy, dripping crates of fish, lobster, or crab from the Maria onto the worn wooden planks of the dock, the orange cat would materialize as if from the fog itself. It would lurk near the pilings, green eyes narrowed, watching with unnerving focus as Marco sorted his catch, readying it for the short haul to the small fish market co-op, or, if it was a smaller load, directly into the back of his ancient pickup truck. Inevitably, during the transfer, a small fish might slip from a net, a crab might scuttle momentarily free, or scraps would fall as Marco quickly gutted a few fish for a waiting customer. And like a flash of orange lightning, the cat would dart in, snatch the offering, and vanish back into the labyrinth of lobster traps and coiled ropes stacked along the wharf. Marco's reaction was equally predictable. A bellow of rage would erupt from his chest, startling the gulls and making nearby fishermen chuckle quietly. Maledetto gatto! Damn cat! Get out of here! He'd lunge, waving a boot or a discarded piece of netting, but the cat was always too fast, disappearing with its prize before Marco's fury could find its mark. "He got you again, Marco?" Another fisherman, old Sal Perino, might call out, a grin splitting his weathered face. "One of these days, that orange menace," Marco would grumble, kicking impotently at a piling where the cat had vanished, his face flushed with anger. "Stealing food right out from under me. Hard work bringing this in." He genuinely resented the cat's thievery. Every fish, every crab represented hours of cold, wet, back-breaking labor. To have even a scrap stolen felt like a personal affront, a violation of the hard-won order he tried to impose on his world. He couldn't understand why the blasted animal targeted him so consistently. There were other boats, other fishermen, other potential sources of discarded bounty along the wharf. But it was always his catch the orange cat seemed determined to raid. The other fishermen mostly found it amusing, a running gag in the daily grind. They called the cat Pirate or Marco's shadow. They ribbed Marco about his inability to deter the creature, suggesting elaborate traps or guard dogs. Marco just scowled, hoarding his resentment, seeing the cat not as a minor nuisance, but as a symbol of the world's tendency to take, to diminish, to steal what little comfort or reward a man could wrest from a hard life. He never stopped to wonder why the cat was so persistent, so driven. He saw only the theft, the orange flash disappearing with a piece of his livelihood. The anger was familiar, uncomplicated, a reliable heat against the chill of his solitude. Chasing the cat, cursing it, became part of his daily ritual, as ingrained as hauling traps or checking the weather, a small, predictable storm in the otherwise quiet harbor of his days. He had no idea that this small, infuriating conflict was about to lead him into waters far deeper and more turbulent than any he navigated aboard the Maria. The weeks bled into November, bringing a sharper edge to the wind that whipped off the Atlantic, and shorter, grayer days. The tourist season was long over, leaving Haven Point to its residents and the stark, elemental beauty of the off-season. Marco Rossi continued his relentless routine, heading out before dawn, returning in the afternoon with his catch, his face grim, his interactions minimal. And nearly every day the orange cat continued its own ritual. It wasn't just the consistency of the cat's appearance that baffled and infuriated Marco. It was its peculiar methodology. Other strays he'd seen around the docks, gaunt and desperate, would gulp down any found scrap immediately, nervously glancing around for competitors or threats. But the orange cat, Marco refused to grant it a name beyond orange menace or various Italian curses, never did that. It would execute its lightning-fast raid, snatching a fallen herring, a small pollock that slipped Marco's grasp, or a decent-sized chunk of fish head he'd discarded after cleaning, and then, instead of retreating to a nearby corner to devour its prize, it would immediately bolt. Holding the fish scrap firmly in its jaws, it would race down the wharf, dodging feet and ropes, and disappear into the narrow, winding back alleys of the village that led away from the harbor. Marco had seen it happen dozens of times. He'd cursed, he'd thrown things, never accurately. He'd even tried preemptively guarding his crates more closely, but the cat was cunning and quick, always seeming to anticipate his movements, always managing to secure some small plunder before vanishing inland. "What's he doing with it?" Marco grumbled one afternoon to Sal Perino, who was mending nets nearby, after the cat had made off with a small whiting. "Never see him eat it. Just runs off like the devil's after him." Sal shrugged, squinting at his net. "Maybe he's got a stash somewhere, Marco, like a squirrel with nuts. Or maybe," he added with a chuckle, "he's taken it home to his missus." Marco just scowled. He didn't find it amusing. The cat's behavior was illogical, wasteful, by the straightforward standards of survival Marco understood. Why steal, if not to eat immediately? It added another layer to his frustration, making the cat seem not just a thief, but a creature of baffling, deliberate annoyance. The villagers mostly shared Sal's amusement or paid the cat little mind. It was a stray, one of several that haunted the periphery of the working harbor. Its focused targeting of Marco's catch just made it slightly more notorious, a small bit of local color. Children sometimes pointed, "Look, there's the fish thief," but no one seemed concerned about where it went or why it behaved as it did. It was just part of the scenery, like the lobster buoys bobbing in the harbor or the perpetual scent of salt and fish. Marco, however, couldn't maintain that indifference. Each successful raid felt like a tiny defeat, a crack in the rigid control he tried to maintain over his small sphere of existence. The cat became an obsession, a focal point for the free-floating frustration and loneliness that simmered beneath his gruff exterior. He started watching it more intently, trying to discern a pattern in its movements, its timing. He noticed its patience. It would arrive silently as he tied up the Maria, often settling partially hidden behind a stack of empty crates, its green eyes fixed on him, waiting. It rarely made a sound, conserving its energy for the crucial moment. It seemed to know exactly when Marco would be distracted, transferring a heavy load, turning to speak to a buyer. Then the quick dash, the grab, the immediate, purposeful retreat. Where did it go? The question began to gnaw at Marco more persistently than the simple anger had. Inland, away from the harbor, into the maze of old houses and neglected yards that climbed the gentle slope away from the water. It always took the same general direction, disappearing down the narrow alley between the chandlery and old Mrs. Gable's boarding house. Curiosity, sharp and unfamiliar, began to mingle with Marco's frustration. It wasn't just about stopping the thief anymore. It was about understanding the why. What drove this strange, persistent ritual? What happened to the fish scraps the orange menace spirited away with such determination day after day? The mystery of the cat's destination began to occupy Marco's thoughts almost as much as the loss of the fish itself, setting the stage for the day his anger would finally give way to action, leading him down a path he never expected to tread. The breaking point came on a particularly raw late November afternoon. The wind howled, driving icy rain mixed with sleet horizontally across the wharf. Marco, soaked and chilled to the bone after a difficult day wrestling nets in choppy seas, was unloading a meager catch. His back arched, his fingers were numb, and his temper was as foul as the weather. He'd just managed to haul a crate of haddock onto the dock when he slipped slightly on the wet planks. A single, decent-sized haddock slithered out of the crate and landed near the edge. Before Marco could even curse his clumsiness, the familiar orange blur materialized from behind a stack of lobster traps. Faster than thought, the cat snatched the flapping fish, a prize larger than its usual scraps, clamped its jaws tight, and pivoted to make its escape. This time, Something snapped in Marco. The cold, the ache, the frustration, the sheer audacity of the cat taking a whole fish. It coalesced into a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. "Not this time, you damn thief!" he roared, abandoning the crate and lunging after the retreating orange form. The cat, perhaps surprised by the speed and fury of Marco's pursuit, or perhaps hampered by the size of its prize, didn't disappear instantly. It scrambled down the main wharf, then veered sharply into the narrow, familiar alleyway between the chandlery and the boarding house. Marco, fueled by adrenaline, followed, his prosthetic leg managing the uneven ground surprisingly well in his anger. He wouldn't lose it this time. He was going to catch this menace, retrieve his fish, and what? He hadn't thought that far ahead. He just needed to catch it. The cat led him on a twisting chase through the damp, narrow backways of Haven Point, areas tourists never saw. Past overflowing bins behind the diner, through neglected backyards choked with weeds and discarded fishing gear, under sagging clotheslines heavy with rain. Marco, panting now, his lungs burning in the cold air, focused solely on the flash of orange fur ahead, the haddock still held firmly in the cat's mouth. He was gaining on it. The cat was clearly tiring, slowed by its burden. It ducked under a broken fence and scrambled across a muddy patch toward the very edge of the village, where the houses grew smaller, shabbier, gradually giving way to scrub pine and rocky outcrops. Marco climbed awkwardly over the fence, ignoring the snag on his oilskins. The cat darted towards one house in particular, set back from the others, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was a small, salt-bleached structure that looked as if it hadn't seen paint or repair in decades. Several windows were boarded up. Others were cracked and grimy. The small yard was a tangle of dead weeds and wind-blown debris. It looked utterly derelict, abandoned. The cat didn't hesitate. It squeezed through a broken board near the foundation of the house and vanished inside. Marco stopped, catching his breath, rain dripping from his sou'wester hat. He stared at the dilapidated house, confused. This was where the cat went? To an abandoned shack? Did it have kittens hidden inside? Or was Sal Perino right? Did it have some kind of hoard? A bizarre pantry of stolen fish? His anger had cooled slightly during the chase, replaced now by a breathless curiosity and a growing sense of unease. The place felt desolate, forgotten. He approached the house cautiously, stepping over rotting timbers on what might have once been a porch. He peered at the nearest grimy window that wasn't boarded up. It was too dark inside to see much, just vague shapes and deep shadows. He listened. He thought he heard a faint sound, a rustling, maybe a low murmur. He moved around to the side of the house, where the foundation board was broken. Crouching down, ignoring the damp cold seeping into his knees, he peered through the gap where the cat had disappeared. The space under the house was dark and smelled of damp earth and something else. Something vaguely rank. Not what he expected. Then he saw movement deeper within the gloom, near where the foundation met the main structure. He strained his eyes, letting them adjust. The orange cat reappeared briefly in a patch of slightly less dense shadow. It no longer held the fish. It nudged something on the ground, looked up toward the floorboards above, and let out a soft, questioning meow, completely different from its usual silence on the docks. Then Marco heard another sound, faint but distinct, coming from inside the house above, A weak cough, followed by a low, frail human voice. "Is that you, Leo? Did you bring something, boy?" Leo? The cat had a name? And someone was inside that wreck of a house? Marco felt a prickle of cold that had nothing to do with the rain. He stood up slowly, his mind racing. He circled back to the front, finding a window where the boards were loose. Gently, quietly, he pried one aside just enough to peer inside the main room. The sight that met his eyes punched the breath from his lungs, stopping him colder than the November wind. The room was almost bare. A few pieces of broken furniture lay askew. Dust and grime coated every surface. In the center of the room, on a sagging mattress laid directly on the floor, covered by thin, ragged blankets, lay an old woman. She was skeletal, her skin like parchment stretched tight over sharp bones. Her white hair was thin and wispy around a face etched with hardship. She looked incredibly frail, barely more than a bundle of rags in the dim, cold room. Beside the mattress, looking up at her expectantly, sat the orange cat, and next to the cat, on the dirty floorboards, lay the haddock Marco had chased it for, looking absurdly large and silver in the gloom. The old woman coughed again, a weak, rattling sound. She slowly, painfully, reached out a trembling hand and rested it on the cat's head. "Good boy, Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Such a good boy. Bringing your old Eleanor something." Her eyes, sunken in her pale face, held a look of profound weariness, but also a flicker of unmistakable gratitude directed at the cat. Marco started, speechless, motionless. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The cat wasn't stealing for itself. It wasn't hoarding fish in some secret stash. It was bringing its meager, stolen bounty here. To her, to this forgotten, starving old woman hidden away in a derelict house everyone assumed was empty. The orange menace, the fish thief, was trying in its own instinctive, desperate way to keep this frail human being alive. And he, Marco, had been cursing it, chasing it, trying to deny it the scraps it brought her. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over him, followed by a wave of bone-deep pity and a sickening awareness of his own callous ignorance. He carefully eased the board back into place, his hands trembling slightly. He backed away from the window, away from the house, his mind reeling. He turned and stumbled back through the rain towards the harbor, leaving the stolen haddock behind. He had seen something he couldn't unsee, learned a truth that shattered his anger, and left only a heavy, aching weight in his fisherman's heart. Marco Rossi walked back toward the harbor in a daze, the driving rain and biting wind barely registering, the image of the frail old woman on the mattress, the orange cat beside her, the stolen haddock gleaming obscenely on the floor. It was seared into his mind. He saw the woman's trembling hand on the cat's head again and heard her weak whisper, "Good boy, Leo." Leo, the thieving pest, had a name and a purpose Marco could scarcely comprehend. He reached the docks, the familiar sounds and smells failing to ground him. Sal Perino and a couple of other fishermen were securing their boats, shouting jokes over the howl of the wind. Marco ignored them, heading straight for his truck, his face grim, his thoughts churning. He drove home through the rain-lashed streets, the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace. Inside his small, neat house, the warmth felt alien, undeserved. He shed his wet oilskins, hung them heavily by the door, and sank into his worn armchair, staring blankly at the opposite wall. The shame was acute. He thought of all the times he'd cursed the cat, chased it, thrown things at it. He thought of his anger over a few stolen scraps of fish, while just blocks away, an old woman was apparently starving, hidden from sight, her only provision the dubious offerings of a stray cat. His stolen scraps. Who was she? Eleanor, she called herself. He vaguely remembered an old Mrs. Ainsworth who used to live out that way, widow of a fisherman named George Ainsworth, who'd been lost at sea years before Marco even started seriously fishing. He hadn't seen her in years, decades maybe. Like most people in Haven Point, he'd assumed the house was empty, condemned even. Had she been there all this time, alone? The village, he thought with a pang of guilt that implicated himself as much as anyone, hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared to notice. Too busy with their own lives, their own struggles. He certainly had been. Lost in his own grief, his own solitude, his own daily grind, he hadn't looked beyond the end of his own pier. He'd seen the cat as a nuisance stealing from him, never once considering the possibility of a need greater than his own perceived loss. And the cat, Leo, a creature driven by instinct perhaps, but demonstrating a loyalty, a connection that seemed almost human in its persistence. Was it possible the cat truly understood Eleanor's plight? Or was it simply bringing prey back to a shared territory, a safe den where Eleanor happened to be? Did the distinction even matter? The result was the same. The cat was providing something: food, companionship, a reason for that frail woman to acknowledge another day, while the human community remained oblivious. Marco felt a deep, uncomfortable shifting within himself. His gruffness, his isolation, his tightly controlled world, it all suddenly felt like a flimsy defense against a profound emptiness he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. He had guarded his small griefs, his small routines, jealously, pushing the world away, and in doing so, he had failed to see the real suffering hidden just beneath the surface of his own small town. He couldn't simply go back to his old routine now, knowing what he knew. He couldn't chase Leo away from the docks again, couldn't begrudge him the scraps, but just letting the cat continue its meager, unsanitary provisioning felt inadequate, almost cruel in its own way. Eleanor needed proper food. She needed warmth. She needed help. Real help. The thought of getting involved made Marco profoundly uncomfortable. He wasn't good with people, especially not with situations involving sickness, poverty, vulnerability. It dredged up too many painful memories: Maria's illness, Antonio's sudden decline, his own helplessness. It was easier to keep his distance, stay self-contained. But the image of Eleanor's face, the gratitude in her eyes as she patted the cat, wouldn't leave him. It wasn't just pity he felt. It was a sense of profound injustice and a reluctant, unavoidable sense of responsibility. He lived in this village. He had, albeit unknowingly, been indirectly connected to her plight through the cat he cursed. He couldn't unknow what he'd learned. He couldn't unseen what he'd seen. He sat there for a long time as the storm raged outside and dusk settled early, wrestling with himself. His instinct was to retreat, to rationalize, to find reasons why it wasn't his problem. Call social services? Maybe, but they could be slow, impersonal. Alert the church? Perhaps. But Eleanor might have her pride. No, the simplest, most direct path felt like the only one that wouldn't leave a permanent stain on his conscience. He had to do something himself. tomorrow, he would face the orange menace, Leo, not with a curse but with something else. And then he would have to face Eleanor. The thought made his stomach clench, but the decision, once made, settled with a surprising firmness. The weight of discovery was heavy, but the weight of inaction, he suspected, would be heavier still. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a sky washed clean and blue. Marco Rossi went through his usual pre-dawn routine, but his movements felt different, charged with a new, uncertain purpose. He took the Maria out, hauled his traps, but his mind wasn't entirely on the familiar task. He kept seeing Eleanor Ainsworth's face, the dilapidated house, the orange cat. He returned to the dock earlier than usual, his catch sorted quickly. As he began unloading the crates, he kept a watchful eye out. Sure enough, just as he hefted the first crate of crabs onto the wharf, the orange cat materialized, slipping silently from behind a stack of nets. It paused, watching him, its green eyes wary but expectant. Marco stopped. He looked at the cat, at Leo. He took a deep breath. Instead of shouting, instead of lunging, he reached into a separate bucket where he'd put aside a couple of perfectly good-sized flounders, fish he could have easily sold. He took one out, walked deliberately toward the spot where the cat usually made its grab, and placed the fish on the planks. He stepped back slowly, saying nothing. Leo seemed utterly bewildered. He stared at the fish, then up at Marco, then back at the fish, as if unable to comprehend this change in the long-established ritual. He took a tentative step forward, sniffed the flounder, then snatched it quickly in his jaws, his ingrained instinct taking over. But instead of bolting immediately, he paused again, looking back at Marco for a fraction of a second with something akin to confusion before turning and racing off down the familiar alleyway. Marco watched him go, a complex knot of emotions tightening his chest. He felt no anger this time, only a strange mix of relief and trepidation. He had taken the first step. Now came the harder part. He finished unloading his catch quickly, sold most of it directly to the co-op manager, and packed the rest into his truck. But instead of heading home, he drove to the small village grocery store. He walked the aisles awkwardly, filling a basket with items he rarely bought for himself: bread, milk, eggs, cheese, canned soup, vegetables, coffee, sugar, even a small package of cookies. Practical things, nourishing things. He paid in cash, avoiding the cashier's curious glance at the uncharacteristic purchases. With the groceries loaded into a sturdy basket on the passenger seat, he drove towards the edge of the village, towards the derelict house he now knew wasn't empty. He parked his truck a short distance away, not wanting to draw attention. Carrying the heavy basket, he approached the house, his heart pounding nervously. He knocked tentatively on the warped wooden door frame, the sound echoing hollowly. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Ainsworth? Eleanor?" He heard a faint stirring inside, then slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door. After a moment, the door creaked open a few inches, revealing Eleanor Ainsworth peering out, her eyes wide with alarm and confusion. She looked even smaller and more frail than she had through the window, swallowed by a threadbare, oversized cardigan. Who is it?" she asked, her voice thin and reedy. Marco cleared his throat, suddenly feeling large and clumsy. "It's, Marco Rossi, ma'am. From the docks?" He held up the basket slightly. I I brought you some things. Groceries." Eleanor stared at him, then at the basket, her expression shifting from alarm to utter bewilderment. "Groceries? For me? But why?" Well, I heard you might be needing a little help," Marco mumbled, feeling his face flush. "And I had extra for my catch today, too," he added, gesturing towards the fish he'd tucked inside the basket. Tears welled up in Eleanor's sunken eyes, spilling silently down her wrinkled cheeks. "Oh my," she whispered, leaning heavily against the doorframe. No one's come by in so long. I didn't think anyone knew." Just then, the orange cat, Leo, appeared from the shadows behind her, winding around her ankles and looking up at Marco with those disconcertingly intelligent green eyes, letting out a soft meow. Eleanor looked down at the cat, then back at Marco, a dawning understanding in her gaze. "It was you?" she asked softly. "The fisherman Leo visits?" Marco nodded, unable to meet her tear-filled eyes directly. "He's persistent," was all he could manage. Eleanor opened the door wider, a gesture of trust that felt momentous. "Please," she whispered, "come in, just for a moment." Marco stepped awkwardly into the dim, cold room. It was even bleaker up close. The damp chill, the lack of furniture, the pervasive sense of neglect. He placed the heavy basket on the floor near her mattress. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion. She reached out a trembling hand, not towards the food, but towards Marco's rough, calloused one. He hesitated, then gently took her hand. Her fingers were bird-like, incredibly fragile. "Thank you, Mr. Rossi. If it weren't for Leo, and now you, I don't know." Her voice trailed off. Marco felt a lump form in his throat. "Just Marco," he said gruffly, "and you shouldn't have to rely on a cat, Eleanor." He looked around the room, taking in the empty hearth, the lack of firewood. "You need more than just food. You need heat. You need—" He trailed off, overwhelmed by the enormity of her need. He stayed only a few minutes, promising awkwardly to come back, to check on her. As he left, stepping back out into the cold, bright sunlight, he felt profoundly changed. The simple act of bringing groceries, of speaking a few awkward words, had breached the walls of his own isolation as much as Eleanor's. He looked back at the house, then down the alleyway towards the harbor. His catch felt different today. It wasn't just about survival or profit anymore. It was about sharing, about connection, about the unexpected responsibility and quiet grace delivered by a thieving orange cat. Marco Rossi became a man transformed, not overnight into a saint, but gradually, profoundly, like the slow turning of the tide. His visits to the dilapidated house on the edge of Haven Point became a regular part of his routine, woven into the fabric of his days as surely as mending nets or checking the weather. He started by bringing practical help, delivered with his characteristic lack of fuss, but unwavering reliability. He chopped and stacked firewood, patching the worst of the drafts around the windows with salvaged boards and tarps. He brought Eleanor hot meals from the diner some evenings, blankets from his own spare bed, repaired the broken step that led up to her door. He learned, through her hesitant piecemeal stories, about her life, about George lost at sea, about children who had moved far away and whose calls became less frequent over the years, about her fierce pride that kept her from seeking help, even as her small savings dwindled and her health failed. Their interactions were often quiet, punctuated by long silences, but a gentle understanding grew between them. Eleanor, initially wary and overwhelmed, slowly began to trust this gruff fisherman who showed up unbidden, offering help without pity or condescension. She started looking forward to his visits, saving snippets of news or memory to share with him. And always, there was Leo, the orange cat, no longer the orange menace, but simply Leo, seemed to accept Marco's presence in his territory, often rubbing against his legs or settling near him while Marco spoke quietly with Eleanor. Marco, in turn, treated the cat with a newfound respect. He made sure there was always a good piece of fish set aside for Leo when he unloaded his catch, placing it down deliberately now, sometimes rewarded with a soft chirp or a slow blink from the green eyes. He even bought a bag of proper cat food to leave at Eleanor's house, ensuring Leo had more reliable sustenance than just fish scraps. Wordlessly, the three formed an unlikely, fragile family unit. The grumpy fisherman, the forgotten widow, and the street-smart cat who had, against all odds, bound them together. News of Marco's quiet efforts inevitably filtered through the close-knit village. Sal Perino saw him carrying firewood towards the Ainsworth place. Mabel at the grocery store noted his regular purchases of extra staples. The amusement surrounding Marco and the fish thief faded, replaced by whispers of surprise, then grudging admiration, and finally, a quiet, collective shame among some that Eleanor's plight had gone unnoticed for so long. Marco's reputation began to change. People greeted him with more warmth, less caution. Some offered quiet words of encouragement or asked if Eleanor and the cat needed anything. Marco usually just grunted non-committally, uncomfortable with the attention, but he noticed the shift. His gruff exterior remained, but people now sensed the current of kindness running beneath it. He found his own life subtly enriched. The gnawing loneliness eased, replaced by a sense of purpose that extended beyond the confines of his boat and his solitary house. Checking on Eleanor, ensuring she had food and warmth, sharing a quiet cup of coffee with her while Leo napped nearby, these small acts filled a void he hadn't consciously acknowledged. He felt more connected to Haven Point, not just as a place where he worked, but as a community he was actively participating in, however late in life. One crisp spring morning, months after his first visit, Marco arrived at Eleanor's house with fresh fish and bread. He found her sitting up straighter in a sturdy second-hand armchair he'd procured, bathed in a shaft of sunlight streaming through a newly cleaned window. Leo was curled contentedly on her lap, purring loudly enough for Marco to hear it from the doorway. Eleanor looked up as Marco entered, her face thinner perhaps, but her eyes held a light that hadn't been there before. "Marco," she greeted him, a genuine smile warming her features. "You're just in time. Leo was just telling me about the fine breakfast you provided him this morning." Marco chuckled, a rough, rusty sound he rarely made. "He earns his keep," he said, setting the provisions down. He looked at the two of them, the frail woman and the devoted old cat, bathed in the morning sun. A profound sense of peace settled over him. The cat, Leo, once the object of his frustration, had led him here, to this unexpected harbor. He hadn't just stolen fish, he had stolen Marco's anger and replaced it with compassion. He had shown Marco the poverty hidden beneath the surface of their village, and in doing so, revealed the poverty within Marco's own isolated heart. From a hated fish thief, the orange cat had indeed become a silent hero, Not just for Eleanor, but for Marco, too. He had reminded them both, and perhaps the whole village, that even in the harshest conditions, loyalty could endure, compassion could blossom, and connection could be found in the most unexpected of ways. Marco Rossi, the grumpy fisherman, finally understood that the most valuable catch wasn't pulled from the sea, but found in the quiet depths of the human heart, sometimes guided there by the unwavering instinct of a simple orange cat.